Good evening, this is Goldie. It's Wednesday, September 22nd, 2010. It's a few weeks before the midterm elections. Remember, most importantly, I rant so that you don't have to, although that doesn't relieve you of your responsibility to think and comment back on some of this stuff. Let me summarize what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to talk about education and personal responsibility. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the housing crisis and the failure of education to teach modern history that might have prevented the collapse. I'll talk about historic districts. I will also talk about the commonized cost, privatized profit game with a few local examples. So I heard Oprah had Bill Gates on this past week. I didn't watch it, but my Tea Party friend did. And Gates was talking about public education and the threat it posed to this country. I heard that he didn't bring up any of the issues that we've talked about, including personal responsibility, and the idea that maybe you are not entitled to have children and have me pay for your children. I understand that Oprah handed out some $1 million checks to charter schools in underprivileged areas as her solution to the problem. Let me go back to what I said in an older rant about personal responsibility. I said, if you're not prepared to send your kids to private school, feed and clothe them yourself, you shouldn't have kids. It's not up to society to educate your children. I mean, if you have a child today and you expect me to pay for your child's education, you make $10 per hour, you're an idiot. I have no duty to educate your child, even though I am willing to do it for the good of society. In fact, there are currently incentives that should not be there today, including in the tax code, student loans, public education, aid to families with dependent children, and welfare. Do you really think that these things are going to continue indefinitely? Garrett Hardin said in Living Within Limits that we make people get licenses to drive cars, but we don't require people to get licenses to have children. Shouldn't we? I've made sacrifices in my life. I've not had children, yet I still continue to pay property taxes, which fund the public schools. Why? Okay, I went a little bit out there on that tirade. I'm actually willing to pay for 2 of your children to go to public school, but no more. I've said that in the past. I'm not willing to pay for the octuplet mom. I believe that there's actually plenty of money to fund an actually good education that will make your children productive members of the U.S. society. However, there are defects in the system, in the bureaucracy of the school districts, in what the teachers' unions are doing for its teachers, and in the curriculums that are taught. And these are all hobbling the public school system. I'm actually not sure what they are, but I'm going to keep looking. Meanwhile, don't have children and then complain. You've been warned. My Tea Party friend and I were separately talking about our structural defect issues, and we were trying to figure out how to educate the kids of today. We agreed the parents are a lost cause, much like the parents of immigrants not learning English, early 1900 Germans, Italians, Russians, and some of today's older Hispanics. I opined again that we need to throw out the textbooks and curriculums and teach through modern American history, starting with today, and then work backwards to 1910 or so. In this way, you would learn about politics, messages, the Constitution, political parties, cameras, surveillance, libertarianism. You can always refer back to the Constitution when appropriate. You can teach math, percentages of voters, surveys, English. But we would have a currently educated population. When we got back to Reagan, you would learn about the deregulation of the S&Ls and the harm that it caused, the 7-to-1 write-offs that caused the Great Recession, the experience with the RTC and FSLIC, more math through the percentage losses of the good properties that got thrown out with the bad. Think when we do modern history in school today, we never get to the present. You would look at Glenn Beck, separation of church and state, TV, MLK, the internet, the civil rights movement, comparing blacks to Muslims and Hispanics, past immigration quotas, guest workers, visas, assimilation. I was speaking to another friend today about this, and he agreed that this method, while difficult, would bring much needed relevance to the curriculum and would maybe help to keep us from repeating our major mistakes in the society that we seem to make over and over and over again. For example, the current housing crisis. Remember when I did my first real estate rant and my first economic collapse rant, I suggested that maybe you might end up being wealthier and happier if you never bought a home. Well, I lived through the Great Recession of 1988 through 1991. This type of housing crisis that we have today, it happened before. So why does no one remember from the past and learn from it? I ask. I was watching Free Speech TV this morning, and there's the story on financial entrapment. Remember those message words when you see them. And it's the idea that people were steered into subprime loans instead of prime loans, where there would have been co-signers and better terms and better interest rates. Okay, so here it is, personal responsibility again. Although I understand that people wanted a part of the American dream. And again, I will say, read the documents. And by the way, I'll repeat this again. Not everyone is supposed to have a home. They had a woman on who was making $10 per hour that qualified for a loan. $10 per hour. She qualified for a home loan. Okay, they had this electrician on in California, and he thought he was going to get a fixed mortgage with a payment of $2,700 per month. $2,700 per month, electrician. And when he got a later mortgage statement, it had gone up to $3,600. So even though there might have been some fraud, if a $900 a month hit is going to make you lose the home, should you really be buying it? Aren't you the definition of marginal? I mean, it wasn't a new home. So what if the water heater in the roof had needed replacement in 1 month? I guess he would have lost the home. Now, I hope I sound heartless, because the universe is heartless. If you borrow money, you need to be panicked at all times. In fact, if you don't borrow money, you're supposed to be panicked at all times. I am. I'm worried about where my next paycheck's coming from. There was a guy in California, and he was talking about whether he should have gotten a 30-year or 7-year or 5-year, and this is when he was deciding what type of mortgage to get. And he decided on a 5-year. Seriously, he thought he could sell or refi in 5 years. Seriously. He was absolutely positive he could do that. Who taught him that? I mean, when I take out a mortgage, I always do a 30-year fixed unless I can afford the higher payment of a 15-year fixed, because I'm risk averse. I read the documents. I'm scared. I'm worried. He said he's being forced out of his house. He doesn't sleep. He cries. Well, so do I. He may have to move into an apartment. His children may have to deal with an apartment. He said that if he could just get out from under this house, he would never make the same mistake again. What a bunch of crap. As soon as people start making a little more money again, they will borrow as much as they can. They always do. This is the American dream. The American dream. Who's to blame? I had a friend of mine say to me today, when I was complaining about this, that a lot of people who were buying these houses did not have a high school education. I said that the signature page is a warning about any fraud on the application leading to civil and criminal liability, including big fines. He said most people are not lawyers and don't understand what that means. Then maybe you shouldn't buy a home if you don't understand that it is against the law to lie on the application about your income. Maybe you shouldn't be allowed to borrow money if you don't have a high school education. Borrow any money, credit card, anything, car. Now there's an incentive for you to finish high school and learn how to read. Okay. Since we can't go back to the beginning where all of these idiots were trying to buy houses and keep them from buying houses, and remember, it was so that they could get rich, the American dream. Let's just go to right now where we all have all these people that do own houses, and are trying to make the payments and preserve their equity, if they even put any in. We know from a previous rant that we've had a declining standard of living since the 1970s. This means that we need 2 incomes to make ends meet when we used to need 1. We need 2 incomes with declining wages to make the payments on the house we shouldn't have bought. It would seem that we would want to have maximum flexibility for our largest investment ever. This means that governing bodies need to give maximum flexibility to property owners. The exact opposite of maximum flexibility is neighborhood-inspired historic zoning and historic districts, at least as they're called here in Austin, Texas. Specifically, the historic districts are things that are pushed by your neighbors on you and which will keep you from doing whatever you need to actually keep your property with the flexibility that we might have without those districts. Let's go ahead and raise some questions about historic districts, historic zoning, and medallions, as well as the tyranny of the majority. In Texas, a city may grant exemptions and reduce property tax burdens to individual properties that are somehow deemed historic. And believe me, it is completely discretionary here in Austin. So in order to get a tax break, you would try and show that your property is historically significant. There's a sizable group of people in Austin, think donors to political campaigns, who promote things over people. These are the people that push these types of historic districts, historic zoning, and historic medallions. They like to keep the big, expensive, old houses that are here. Back in 2005, I gave a speech to the City Council of Austin on this and the problems with historic zoning and our need for increased density closer to the core. Again, this is an April 7th, 2005 speech. It's just a part of it. Also, quotes, also, Envision Central Texas has helped everyone think in a new way. Density. And density meaning a good thing. Density meaning more neighbors to help create real community. Because neighbors and people is really what it takes. Since we are on the road to the completion of a process that will greatly increase all surrounding property values and, of course, property taxes, we must speak of gentrification, or at least my definition, the moving out of longtime neighbors from 2 categories of housing, owners and renters. I attended a candidate forum on the East Side on Tuesday, this is back in 2005, and heard one candidate for City Council mention the magic words, permanent low-income housing, as of course, the word affordable does not mean anything unless defined each time you use it. I attended the gentrification forum this past Saturday at ACC, and all agreed that we cannot ignore the net effect of more development on the East Side. Very, very few proposals were offered, as it's an extremely difficult issue that the Austin Revitalization Authority and other bodies have been wrestling with. We all know that a freeze on city taxes is only a small solution to the problem, as city taxes are a small percentage of the total. A couple of contributing factors, contrary to a popular view, is that it appears that residential restrictions, residential design guidelines, and historic districts all contribute to taxable value increases for residences. Just because a house is old does not make it historic. A critical phrase comes to mind: people over things. That's what the discussion of gentrification is about. If we follow our goal of a mixed income, mixed race neighborhood, then solutions do come to mind. The ARA has even recently amended one of its guiding preservation principles to include significant historical structures rather than just historical structures. People over things. When Atlanta passed its historical districts, they funded permanent land trusts so that rental properties could stay in a permanent, affordable, low-income pool. I suggest the same solution here. People over things. Additionally, giving existing owners more options on what to do with their property might also be helpful. I know it's contrary to the anti-super duplex mentality on the west side, but my suggestion is 2-family garage apartments, 850 square feet on the top floor and 500 on the ground floor, so that they can either be rented out excuse me, so they can either be rented out or so the kids can stay with the parents, but not inside the parents' house. This will keep longtime neighbors and families here longer, both owners and renters, and will add small unit options to the rental pool. Okay, that was a quote out of my speech. I was trying to say that when you try and preserve historic structures, it does two things. It raises values and taxes, and it limits what can be done with a property. I was trying to promote 5 years ago the actual idea that if you're trying to slow gentrification and keep longtime families in the east side of Austin, preserving historic structures is exactly the opposite of the solution that is needed. The solution is more flexibility, relaxed zoning, two-family garages on the back of properties, and boarding houses like the 30s and the 40s. My point back then was, during the boom time, we had a gentrification problem where lower income families were being forced out because people were just coming in and buying these close-in houses. My point today is that during this bad time, in order to even keep your home, you need the additional flexibility that I suggested back then. And definitely not historic districts. Definitely not anything that's going to restrict your property. And definitely not anything that's going to raise the value and raise the taxes. Okay. Recently, though, the city of Austin started limiting the number of homes per month that could be deemed historic, and with them, the tax exemptions. Several of the taxing districts are actually eliminating any kind of reduction for these historic homes. So hopefully it's just going to go away. And with it, maybe the historic districts. That's a hard battle. On 8/26/10, there was a story in the Statesman that showed one of the council members warning a property owner that the tax exemption might go away, much as the Austin Independent School District has been discussing, while pointing out that the prior properties would be grandfathered. What? We don't need to grandfather anybody on this. I mean, this was just a giveaway to rich people. That's why they started limiting the numbers they could do monthly. Now, we have something else in Texas. It's the homestead exemption. And I ask, what about homestead exemptions? It's a reduction of property taxes in Texas. Everybody's entitled to it on one property. No one should expect that those are going to continue. No one's entitled to the status quo when it comes to a benefit not conferred on everyone else, just like these historic exemptions. The city may argue that they will get sued if they no longer grant the reduction of taxes for historic structures. Well, let them. It's like moving next to an airport and then complaining about the airplane noise. If you thought your exemption was going to continue, you're an idiot. I talked about how none of us are entitled to the status quo as to health care or government services, think Social Security, as it will not continue. There isn't the money. And let me tell you the worst thing about historic districts, of which there's only one in Austin right now. If 50% of the property owners within a gerrymandered area agree, in other words, they draw the lines around it, then the area within the boundary becomes a historic district, and with it comes a whole new set of regulations and restrictions. Paint, windows, entryways, type of roof. You might not be able to put a metal roof up there. Think about it. Your neighbors then tell you, what to do with your property. Tyranny of the majority at its worst, just because they like the look of your house, or it was built in 1900. Well, let me tell you this. I want the right to burn my house down, and not arson to collect insurance, but just the right to tear it down and build what I need it to be. And I think there are a whole lot of other Austinites, Texans, and Americans that are in the same boat. They need this flexibility. And I ask you all, do not vote for more regulations restricting what you can do with your property. It's bad for you. It's bad for society. And if it's not bad for you now, it will definitely be bad for you later. It will be bad for your heirs later. Okay. Excuse me. It's water. Let's go back to the Commons a little and look at it another way. Last week I talked about how Garrett Hardin, you better be buying his books and reading, how Garrett Hardin had come up with this idea of a commonized cost, privatized profit game, where companies attempted to push off as many costs as they could onto the commons or the government and keep the increased profits from what they pushed off for themselves. I gave the example of the cattlemen that ran their cattle on the government-owned land and were charged 1/5 of what private landowners charged. I opined that this was one more structural regulatory defect that needed to be fixed. Well, later in the book, Hardin talks about the phrase externalities as a phrase used by economists. He also stated that it was used by these companies that wanted to commonize some of their costs. The examples I gave are coal dust in the air causing asthma and cancer, BP oil spills eventually having to be cleaned up by us, the taxpayer, the Exxon Valdez cleanup, mountaintop coal mining, the cost of us subsidizing the cutting of forests. Excuse me. Here's an example of externalities or commonized costs from September 20th, 2010 in the Austin American-Statesman. It's entitled, "With Fitness Boom, City Weighs Fee for Holding Classes in Parks." Apparently, there are a bunch of different types of private classes being held in Zilker Park and other public parks in Austin, where the people that make the privatized profits pay no fee and do not carry insurance to hold these classes in these public parks. The proponents that are getting this free use say that the city wants to promote Austin as one of the fittest cities in the country, and we're getting there because so many groups can use parks as a resource. Okay, so this is exactly the same as cattlemen underpaying for pasture land on federal land and BP underpaying for drilling leases in the Gulf of Mexico. And except for the fact that these groups, the regulated, as I have defined them in prior rants, are not currently writing the regulations, it's the same externalization or commonization of costs at the expense of the commons and ultimately at the expense of us, the taxpayers. I can guarantee you that any fee that these groups end up paying will not cover the damage to the commons, as the people negotiating with these groups, our city council members, are not playing with their own money. They're playing with our money. Okay. Another example of this exact same thing, but much more egregious, is highlighted by a story in the Austin American-Statesman dated September 22nd, 2010, with the title of "City Moles Plan to Take Back Unused Drugs." About a year ago, I was cleaning out my cabinets and found some old unused prescription medications. I went to the H-E-B pharmacy, CVS, and Walgreens and asked them if they had a safe disposal method. They all said that it was safe to flush them down the toilet. Okay, I have to do this. They all said it was safe to flush them down the toilet. Antibiotics, whatever. Okay. So the proposal is for the city to take back these drugs that should not be in our water or environment with taxpayer funds. So they're going to use taxpayer funds to keep these drugs out of the water or the environment. This shows the commonized cost game of externalities with the drug companies pushing the costs to the commons and to us, the taxpayers. However, this one also shows the structural regulatory defect of the regulated writing the regulations through their control of the politicians to whom they give unlimited campaign contributions under the Citizens United case. Let me give you a more generalized example of the exact same thing. When I went to Fry's in Dallas this past weekend and bought a 2 terabyte external hard drive, my computer guy was really excited at how cheap it was. I started ranting that it was because we are not required to recycle or return this product back to the manufacturer, so that they would pay the cost of the extraction of the dangerous cancer-causing chemicals and plastics that were contained in the device. The costs are pushed, externalized, or commonized to us, the taxpayer, in the form of higher health care costs and costs at the landfills and the cost of cleaning the groundwater under the landfill from these harmful agents. I stated that the $104 cost was so low because the company was not absorbing these costs, which of course would be passed along to the consumer. And I suggested that it might actually cost like $300, I don't know. Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but it seems like it's cheaper to have the company dispose of I don't know the answer to this question, but is it cheaper to have the company dispose of this, or is it cheaper to have our inefficient governments dispose of these things and do the cleanups, all the cleanups that I described? And maybe clean up the air, too, when they do the chopping up of these things in the landfills. And I do think you know the answer. Slightly interesting is the fact that here in Austin, a company called Batteries Plus recycles for free any batteries that you bring into their store. You don't even have to buy a battery there to avail yourself of this service. I wonder if they are required under the city permits to do this. I don't know. It's sure worth the free advertising if they are not required to do this. And Matt, this is not an example of corporate altruism. This is a selfish act by them because it gets me into their store. Maybe I'll buy some batteries there. Okay. I want to go back to education for a minute. I'd said in the past that one of the good things about email, and now texting, was that kids were learning how to write again. The Austin American-Statesman on September 20th, 2010 smacked me down on that count. The op-ed says, "You can't consider what Twitter users write real, effective communication." It's a bad title. In the article, it points out actually worse English usage due to the abbreviations used in text and tweets. It also points out some studies that show that the more we multitask, especially in these tiny 140-word communications, the less creative our minds become. I have a friend who's an English teacher, and her pet peeve is bad punctuation in a text. I suggest that more parents monitor their kids' texts and at least help improve the grammar and the punctuation. And then we will have achieved something in education through this new technology. And Urban, I apologize for my bad punctuation and grammar in this rant. Okay, Judge Napolitano had someone from the Ayn Rand Institute this weekend on, and this gentleman said that we subsidize too many things all the time, including home ownership through the mortgage deductions, as well as other incentives like credits for insulation, etc. I agree that we should get rid of that deduction. However, there's a very large and powerful group, the realtors, and they give hefty sums to politicians under the structural regulatory defect made worse by Citizens United. We need the constitutional amendment. It keeps coming up over and over and over again. Exxon is not a person. They are not entitled to free speech rights like people, which allows them to give unlimited campaign contributions, or at least buy unlimited advertising for politicians. Okay. I was speaking with a fan, and he was saying that we need to restructure what corporations are to more closely what they were originally formed for. I retorted that corporations are used to limit liability, and then in the United States, we took the English system of laws, and with it, the laws as to corporations. He stated that in the United States, there were original purposes that were only for good, like building bridges and other public purposes, that were the original intent of having these entities, and that I need to watch the documentary The Corporation, which I'm going to do. However, today, corporations and their closely related brethren, limited partnerships and limited liability companies, are used by almost all businesses to raise capital and limit liability. Our society has deemed it to be in our best interest to allow these capital-forming and profit-distributing entities that limit the investor's liability to what they invest, unless they sign a guarantee or a personal guarantee. By the way, in the legal profession, at least in Texas, the formation of an entity by lawyers, like a LLP, it doesn't limit the lawyer's liability for his or her own malpractice. Okay, just want to let you know that one. So we can't limit our liability for malpractice. And I'm not giving legal advice. Okay. Now, the large point that he was making had something to do with moral laws that corporations should follow. And you can remember in my BP 1 through 5, corporations are not evil. They can't be evil. I became extremely agitated because I think he's missing the main point that I've been making since the beginning of the BP disaster. We want corporations, much like individuals, to maximize their profits within the legal laws. Not any type of moral laws, which I believe are unenforceable. It's only this maximization of profits that allows us to do things like this rant, or drive to Dallas, or buy a 2 terabyte hard drive for $104. It's up to us, the voters and taxpayers, to properly institute this system of laws that corporations and individuals must follow. It is not up to corporations to be altruistic or green, for example. Their duty is to their investors. It's our duty to properly regulate through laws. As I was trying to get some examples out of him of moral laws that corporations should follow, he couldn't really come up with any. However, I came up with an example of a moral law that was given the teeth of legal law, and it was adultery, which was originally immoral, 10 Commandments, and illegal, with the threat of incarceration, and which is not now illegal in the United States. So I then compared the enforcement of laws on corporations with the enforcement of taxes on individuals. And I realized that if we hired a ton of auditors and audited everybody and charged you for the cost of the audit if you're underpaying by, say, 2%, which would be found out in the audit, that would change the nature of voluntary compliance. So the comparison is not a real good comparison. I was just trying to come up with examples for him of when a corporation should do something. The only reason a corporation should do something is to either make more money or to follow the law. That's it. Similarly, I couldn't think of a single law that a corporation should follow, that a corporation would then follow if it was only should. I like to use the word shall or must. That's why we have laws. It's our duty. Their duty is not to should or will, maybe, or hope to follow. All right. I was speaking with my Tea Party friend again. I speak with him a lot. He was complaining a little about last week's rant when I called those two guys on AM radio Republicans. Remember, these guys called the John Roberts Supreme Court, following their decision in Kelo versus New London, a liberal court. The Kelo decision was an eminent domain decision that said that eminent domain could be used for economic purposes versus traditional public purposes such as roads, railroads, and schools. I opined that these two guys on radio were Republican because they had used the message word liberal to describe the court, really as to a decision that the court decided which these guys did not like. That's what they were saying, that it was a liberal court. Which is totally false, by the way. The court is neither liberal nor conservative, and the decision in Kelo was in fact a decision for crony capitalism of the worst sort. He realized that whenever I use the word Republican, he gets his panties in a wad. I then realized that we need to get past that sort of messaging as well. And I told him that he had to start watching Keith Olbermann, Rachel Maddow, and The Ed Show for me and for our discussions. I watch O'Reilly, Hannity, and Glenn Beck, and it took me a long time to get over the sickness that I felt when I listened to those guys and their messages. But for the good of this show and for the good of the country, I'm taking one for the team, and he needs to do the same, and you know who you are. It's his job to watch what he hates, to get over his hate, to see the matrix, as they said in that movie, the dripping green dots that represent corporate and union America using our energy to power their profits and self-interests. I have a question for the Tea Party. If you're libertarian, why are you not reaching out to those anti-war people on the left? And I have a question for libertarians like Judge Napolitano that say, if it's not in the Constitution, then it shouldn't be a law. If you're against regulations, then why don't we start with, let's say, promissory notes related to home purchases and get rid of the requirement that we put the terms of repayment in the promissory note as is currently required under federal law. Okay? So let's have you sign a note at closing that says they will tell you what it is later. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Well, it's not in the Constitution. So do you really trust Citibank to keep to the terms of their oral agreement with you as to what your interest rate should be? I really think that ends the argument. So if you're a libertarian or Tea Partier or both, please be discriminating in your arguing for less and clearer and more effective regulation rather than no regulation. And let's get that constitutional amendment passed. MoveOn.org and the Tea Party should be in complete agreement on that constitutional amendment, but I don't hear any linkages, which makes me feel like the Tea Party is really just trying to get some Republicans elected. I hope not. Okay. I was speaking with some other friends, following my past rant, and they started telling me about how unions are really, really important. Now, my comments about unions so far have been about how they collect union dues, lobby Congress, just like corporations do, and are part of the structural regulatory defect that requires changing by my proposed constitutional amendments. Now, I did actually today mention that it seems like that teachers' unions are not doing a good job, okay? And as I said, we did talk about the teachers' unions. I mentioned I thought they were doing a pretty terrible job at representing teachers. Okay. We always hear about how teachers are underpaid. We did not always hear about how GM workers were underpaid, at least before the bailout. I think we've always heard about how GM workers are overpaid and get great health care and have a great pension, or had a great pension, which I believe most of that stuff is going to go away. So I want to do some more investigating about unions through the teachers' unions, and I definitely invite your comments, and those of you that are teachers, like you, Urban, please give me some input on that. Okay. As I previously said, we need to watch the administration's push for the drug war prior to this November's elections with its numerous marijuana legalization initiatives. Here's one, or at least here's a message. Mexican drug cartels are growing marijuana, battling booby traps to pull up these plants. Oh, they were just talking about how our troops are having to battle booby traps to pull up these plants. And that was September 9th, 2010 on Fox. It was a small little blurb. Showed troops in national forests. On September 22nd, 2010 on Fox and Friends, there was a story about how U.S. agents are collecting big piles of drug money illegally, showing the failure of protecting our border. So they did a linkage, without, of course, showing the failure of the drug war. 90% of cocaine and 50% of marijuana comes from Mexico. They interviewed an Arkansas congressman who tied 230 U.S. cities to drug cartels, illegal immigration, and terrorism, and said we need to screen our agents better. Not a single word about prohibition and its effect on all of this. Let's look at it another way. A 200-pound human requires food, air, and water to get him across the border. 200-pound. He maybe generates $2,000 to the smuggler. I've heard that number before. A 200-pound block of cocaine, even ignoring cutting it, which would multiply this final weight by up to, who knows, 20, 100 times. It's 200 pounds times 454 grams, times $40 on the street per gram, for a total of $3,632,000. So $2,000 plus air, food, and water, and somebody might yell out, versus $3 million plus. When you hear the message phrase, drug smuggling and illegal immigration, oh, and terrorism, like I just heard, when you hear all that together, realize that the person speaking it is pushing forward the message of fear and continuing the drug war for the benefit of our drug companies, trying to get me addicted to Oxy and Vicodin for a tiny, tiny copay. A buddy of mine sent me a link to a guy who was arrested at a state fair in Alaska for having an Impeach Obama poster with a Hitler mustache on it. And I'll give you the link now. It'll be on next week's email. But it's vodpod, vodpod.com/watch/432-079. It's pretty horrific. The guy had a big giant poster inside the grounds of a state fair. He was complaining about people that had T-shirts that had political messages on it. I just like watching it. It was interesting to watch. I don't really have an opinion on it because I think that probably to advertise you probably needed a permit to get in there, and he could have just as easily gotten a permit to advertise Lyndon LaRouche. And I also suggest that, and I've seen Lyndon LaRouche at the post office over here in Austin. Not him, but his supporters out there. And I suggest you guys, you Lyndon LaRouche supporters, I would go ahead and have pictures of the last 5 or 6 presidents on their posters with Hitler mustaches, just to be inclusive. If you do that, then I get your point. When you only have Obama, it's a little tougher point to make. That's all there is today. By the way, next week, I may have some technical difficulties. We may be doing a complete free-range rant with my buddy Swill in the same room. Even though I might send out an email alert before I go there, the rant may not occur, and I apologize. It just depends on the Wi-Fi. And I apologize ahead of time. All right, I want to thank our sponsors, all of which support this form of conversation, but not necessarily the content of this conversation. PianoByAngelo.com, Angelo Limbesis. ZitaDesign.com, Z-I-T-A Design.com for all of your decorative painting needs. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your plumbing problems and redos. TicoAdventureLodge.com, I know they're listening today, hopefully. TICOAdventurelodge.com, a small hotel in Samara, Costa Rica. CNCSurfSamara.webs.com, which is a surf school in Samara. La Vela Latina, a great sunset restaurant in Samara. Ambar Tequila at www.santospirits.com, and quite a few bars. And it's an extremely smooth tequila. And for Monica and Quinn in Samara, check out their little hotel at www.villablanca, B-L-A-N-C-A, samara.com. Thanks, and God bless.